You're muted, Casey.
Hey, Eric.
Howdy, howdy.
Hey, Rob, Casey, Ashley, nice to meet you.
Hey everybody, can y'all hear me?
Hey, Rob.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
Hey, Rob.
Hi, Eric. Hi, Kristen. Hi, Ashley.
Howdy, Casey.
Hello.
All right, I have a few questions for you guys about slides before we get started. So Rob has nicely agreed to run the slideshow. So thank you, Rob. Oh, if you can
Sorry,
hear us.
it's connected to definitely the wrong headphones here.
Oh, I hate when that happens.
Yeah, I was like, what? I can kind of hear you. Just turn this off.
All right, so I guess this question is for Kristen or Eric. Slide 35 and 36. I threw those in early and it wasn't really a part of my history of feed grounds, but does someone want to scoop those up or should we delete them? And I know I saw Eric, you basically have the same slide, so I'm happy to delete that one. I just stole it from a different PowerPoint. On 36.
Well, yeah, I guess I've already got 36, but we can move 35 down and make
Okay.
that the kind of title slide.
Sweet. Connecting slide. So delete 36 on it. Cool. And then
And it looks like the other title slide's gone already, so that works.
sweet.
Easy peasy.
All right. That was my last question. That was my main question. You guys all feeling okay?
I mean,
I'm feeling a little queasy and nervous here. I might get stage fright.
yeah, like presentationally wise, I'm feeling great. Physically, not so good.
Oh, you said you were sick.
I cannot believe
Are you still fighting the Rona?
I don't know if it's like a relapse or if it's just like you run of the mill cold, but I was feeling I had it real bad Friday and Saturday.
I guess that dings you all, huh? And then, yeah, should I start letting folks in from the
Sure.
waiting room? All right. Or I guess, let me present my screen first.
Go back one slide. That is the better one though, I guess. There we go. Thank you. Yeah, let him in.
Hi, everyone. We're going to give people about another minute or so to get in. We're going to start right at 7 just to try to keep this at an hour. But we'll give them another minute or so. Thanks for coming tonight. So we'll go ahead and get started. I'll keep letting people in from the waiting room, but I am Ashley and I am a part of the Sierra Club Wyoming Chapter's Public Lands and Wildlife Volunteer Group. So I'm just going to be a moderator for this event. Casey and Rob with the Sierra Club have put together a really cool panel of conservation and wildlife experts for us tonight, which is awesome. Thank you to those two for organizing this. So I will let these people introduce themselves. First, we have Eric, and he's with the Western Watersheds Project.
Well, thank you. And my name is Eric Molvar. I am the executive director of Western Watersheds Project, which is a nonprofit conservation group that works to protect and restore watersheds and wildlife throughout the American West with a heavy focus on public lands. And I myself am a wildlife biologist with scientific research in the effects of moose herbivory on ecosystem dynamics and also the effect of predation risk, specifically wolves and grizzly bears, on the evolution of social behavior in Alaskan moose. And I'll hand off to our next presenter.
Hello, everybody. I'm Kristen Combs. I'm the executive director for Wyoming Wildlife Advocates. We're based in Wilson, but work throughout the state to inform, educate, and empower people and communities to preserve our wild legacy and shared resource of wildlife. I'm based in the GYE and have over 20 years of experience learning about and working with different education issues that are here in the GYE. And we do focus a lot on large carnivore preservation as a way of preserving biodiversity. And I will hand it off to Casey.
Thanks, everybody. Yeah, Casey Premadel here, Public Lands and Wildlife Organizer for the Sierra Club Wyoming Chapter. Very happy to be here tonight. And yeah, I'll pass it back to Ashley. And the previous slide, she'll talk about what we're going to run through tonight.
Thanks, Casey. So tonight we're going to learn a little bit about the history of elk feeding grounds, and then we'll hear from our experts about the risks associated with those feed grounds and like alternatives and solutions. And then we're kind of at an interesting point with where the Wyoming Game and Fish is in the middle. They're in like a review process for this program. So it's like a good time to be learning more about this if you haven't known a lot about it in the past, such as me, because there's, action steps we can take at this point. So it's a good time to be learning about these things. And yeah, so first we're going to have Casey, and she's going to go over the history and just kind of like how we've gotten to where we are today.
Thanks so much, Ashley. Yeah, so next slide, please, Rob. All right, so kicking it off. So elk have been in North America for a very long time. They were first found in the fossil record over 2 million years ago. There was an estimated 10 million elk pre-colonization, so before 1500s. They had a little rough time after colonization happened. In the 1770s, eastern elk were hunted to extinction. There were a few different subspecies. In the 1860s, Midwestern elk were hunted to extinction. And then by the 1900s, there's an estimated only 40,000 elk remaining, mostly in and around the greater Yellowstone region. Today, there's around 1 million elk, and there have been many reintroduction programs in various states after they were almost hunted to extinction. Some of these states, nearby neighboring states of Wyoming, were Utah, Colorado, New Mexico. Elk have been reintroduced to Kentucky, Michigan, and Wisconsin as well. Next slide, please. So elk deserve to thrive in their own habitat. Early management decisions left little room for elk to thrive in Wyoming. They still face challenges today. They face challenges with development, changing landscapes, fences, and feed grounds, and all of these affect their natural migrations. Next slide, please. So the Wyoming Migration Initiative did some pretty amazing research. And as you can see here on this map, they have radio collared and tracked various herds all around the greater Yellowstone, and each herd is represented by a different color. Recently there's been a push to protect these migration corridors and help restore migration corridors that are no longer intact. So wild migrations are very difficult to reestablish. Once lost, it is possible, and the repopulation of elk to neighboring states proves this. And I'll give you some good resources for this map and later on as well. Next slide, please. All right, so as I mentioned, there's around 1 million elk that live in the US today. Of that 1 million, approximately 2% are artificially fed, and all of these 25,000 elk, or 2%, are within the 22 state-ran elk feed grounds in west central Wyoming. Other states face similar issues that Wyoming does, and some of the issues that elk are facing today are competition for forage, the prioritization of cattle over native species on public lands, and though other states face these same problems, none of the other states have these feeding programs such as Wyoming. So why does Wyoming? Next slide, please. All right, so like I mentioned, some of the neighboring states are very similar and face similar issues. So Wyoming is approximately the same size as Colorado. Even though Colorado has 10 times the human population and nearly 3 times the number of elk, Colorado doesn't feed any of their elk in the winter. You can see some statistics there. Next slide, please. So why did artificial feeding start, and why do feed grounds still exist 110 years later? So according to the Wyoming Game and Fish, elk feeding began in 1912 after a few really severe winters where a lot of elk died from starvation. So it really started as a conservation movement because of the loss of habitat from development and ranching. However, these feeding has continued for 100 years, and now they may cause more problems than they're solving. So another reason that they still exist is tourism. As you can see here, people take sled rides every winter and while it may seem appealing, it reinforces the anthropomorphic ideas about elk, and it reinforces the assumed idea that they need us to survive. Next slide, please. So why does Wyoming Game and Fish justify feeding elk? So some of the reasons that elk feeding continues, a lot of them have to do with politics. Some of the reasons they feed elk is so damage doesn't occur to stored crops. As you can see here, this is an example of where they feed elk to keep them away from the fenced off hay. And this could be solved by regulation 8-foot fences. Next slide, please. Some other reasons that the Game and Fish justifies feeding elk is so wildlife and cattle don't commingle. Elk feed grounds are used to lure elk away from cattle operations. Commingling can cause an array of livestock and wildlife diseases to be transferred, which Kristen will talk about. Next slide, please. Another reason is because the forage that the elk would normally eat is prioritized for cattle. So decades of livestock grazing on Forest Service and BLM lands have left little room for native species such as elk. A good example of this is blue bunchgrass, which grows really tall the elk would dig through to dig through the snow to get to is now virtually extinct. So next slide, please. So there's some serious downsides to feeding. It's also expensive. The annual budget for elk feed grounds is $2 million of state money. It's unnatural. Native species should be able to thrive in their own habitat and not treated like livestock, and it's dangerous. As we all learned from being in a pandemic for the last few years, concentrating anything in large numbers aids in the transmission of disease. Next slide. So for the health of the elk, our organizations, along with environmental advocates, game and fish state veterinarians, disease experts, former elk refuge officials, all argue for the end of feeding. But we also care about the health of the elk. We don't want to immediately cut off their food source. It has to be a part of a larger solution. So we are advocating for feed grounds to be phased out over the course of a few years. And there are examples of where elk feeding has been phased out. There's a ranch in Utah called the Desert Ranch that has been well studied, and they phased out elk winter feeding over the course of a few years and were able to do it successfully. The state of Montana also used to feed elk and now doesn't anymore. So that has also been phased out. So it is possible. And we're going to mention some other solution and avenues for this to happen. So thank you. I'll pass it on to Kristen.
Thanks, Casey, for that informative background. That's kind of how we got to where we are today. I'm going to talk a little bit about the risks of feeding elk, and most of that centers around wildlife diseases, of course. Next slide. Obviously, the one that we're most concerned about, and that is probably the most threatening to the elk population right now, is chronic wasting disease. Chronic wasting disease it's a unique disease in that it's not caused by a virus or a bacteria like other diseases that we think about. This is caused by a misfolded protein called a prion. And this prion is something that the body doesn't see as something that is, foreign and something that it should eradicate. It just sees it as a regular protein. And eventually this protein causes other proteins in the body to be misshapen and misfolded in the same way. This normally happens in first the lymph tissue and the spinal tissue, and then eventually spreads to the brain, where this misshapen protein causes a breakdown in cells, and we get to where the brain starts to look a little spongy. It's part of a disease, of a series of diseases called spongiform encephalopathies. And so that basically are the diseases that we think of when we think of mad cow. It's a very similar type disease. And this disease was actually spread to wild animals from sheep that have a similar disease called scrapie. And there was a research facility in Colorado that had sheep that were penned up and had scrapie, and then wild elk became in contact with that and came down with this chronic wasting disease, and then it spread from there. So it's a pretty slow progressing disease. It's not something that we see animals die from right away, but it is 100% fatal. And there's no cure or vaccine because of the fact it's kind of like cancer in a way. It's like, how do you teach the body to see this as a foreign object and attack it without also attacking healthy cells? Obviously, proteins are very important in all kinds of biological systems. And so without those proteins acting normally, it causes a breakdown in the system. And so elk that come down with chronic wasting disease are usually seen being listless and standing around, usually not able to feed themselves or drink anymore, and so die from wasting away, literally. And the thing about it is that we don't see evidence of elk with chronic wasting disease until the disease is very advanced. So usually you're looking at 18 to 24 months before any outward symptoms or signs show, which makes it difficult because we can't just call these animals out, because the meantime, while they have it, they're also spreading it in their environment. And it lasts for years in the environment. There's some studies out there that are showing it can last up to 15 and 16 years plus in the environment, which is a very scary situation in that once it is present in an environment, it's very difficult to get rid of. And so there's been captive facilities that have had elk and deer with chronic wasting disease, and researchers have gone in there and basically napalmed it and just poured tons of bleach and everything else they could throw at it, and really it still was present when they repopulated with animals 5-10 years later. So there's no way to really eradicate it once it's in the environment. There is some a little bit of experimental evidence out there that shows that certain types of soil can help to sort of neutralize this protein, but that's kind of really cutting edge stuff and really hasn't been proven yet. The other problem with it is that we can only test for it on dead individuals. So, you can't just take a blood sample or take a sample of tissue or something out of a live animal. Unfortunately, the animal has to be dead in order for us to understand if it is contagious for chronic wasting disease. And it also has the potential to cross species barriers. As we all know, mad cow in the 1980s was thought to be just a livestock disease until it did cross the species barrier. There's been a little bit of experimental evidence to show that macaque monkeys that are fed meat with chronic wasting disease did come down with it. So that's just something that wildlife biologists are monitoring as this disease kind of advances to see, can people get it? Certainly can, it has the potential to cross species barriers into cattle and other livestock or other wildlife as well. Right now, it's only found in ungulates that are cervids. So we're talking about elk, deer, moose, and reindeer. Next slide. Here's a slide that just kind of shows you where the elk feed grounds are. So mostly concentrated in Lincoln County and Sublette County and Teton County. Next slide. And I'll kind of show you just a progression of how chronic wasting disease has kind of marched its way across the state. So prior to 2000, like I said, this disease originated in a research facility down in Colorado and then spread to Wyoming and other areas from there. So next slide. It first took hold in southeastern Wyoming. Next slide. And eventually all of the areas that you see on this map are deer and elk hunt areas. So when, if you're wondering why there's kind of a weird polygon, it's usually, bordered by some kind of a creek or a road that is sort of designating where the hunt area is located. Next slide. So by 2014, there was a moose that was found right on the border of Idaho and Wyoming that had tested positive for chronic wasting disease. And that was sort of the closest that chronic wasting disease was ever found to a feed ground at that point. Next slide. And then by 2015, we start to see it get a little bit closer, especially just east of or just west of Lander. Next slide. By 2016, it moved a little bit closer. Next slide. And then by 2017, we start to see it, really start to inch in and get closer, especially to the eastern boundary of Yellowstone National Park and up into Park County. Next slide. 2018, go ahead, next slide. And then finally, in 2022, this is the most current map. Our map hasn't been updated quite yet, but this shows the brown areas are elk hunt areas that are positive for chronic wasting disease, and the pink areas are deer that have been found to be positive with chronic wasting disease. And so you can see it's really surrounding where the feed grounds are located. And while we do not have a confirmed, we don't have a confirmed incidence of chronic wasting disease being found on a specific feed ground, but we have found chronic wasting disease in elk herds that spend time on feed grounds, including elk that spend time on the National Elk Refuge, which is the largest sort of feed ground in the state. Okay, next slide. So chronic wasting disease is a scary disease, and it's something that we're really going to have to reckon with as a state. We haven't done much about it, and we're sort of seeing what the effects, those long-term effects, are now. Another disease that we've done more about, but is still a big threat to elk and other species, is brucellosis. This is caused by a bacteria, so there is a vaccine for it. The livestock vaccine actually works quite well. The wildlife vaccine doesn't work as well. It's really quite ineffective. Usually this bacteria causes an animal to abort their first fetus. Usually in subsequent pregnancies, they don't abort their fetus anymore, and so they can go on to reproduce in the future. They usually become immune after they have had it. There was a test and slaughter program to try and see if we could eradicate brucellosis on feed grounds in Wyoming. That program ended up being a horrible, kind of a failure. I mean, we saw that we could definitely reduce prevalence rates, but in order to do so, we had to capture more than half of the female elk and eradicate the ones that tested positive. And the minute you let up on it, basically it came back. And not only are you having to sort of capture the elk that are found on feed grounds, once they wander off the feed grounds, they're still able to pick up brucellosis and transmit it across the landscape. So testing and slaughtering turned out to be ineffective and was not a good way to get sort of around that disease. It's not a huge limiting factor for population growth in elk. We do see some like 20% prevalence rates on feed grounds. It's almost non-existent in free-ranging elk in the state. If you look at the eastern part of the state, we just don't have brucellosis there. It's more of a livestock industry issue in that the livestock industry, if a cattle herd comes down and has brucellosis, then the state could lose its brucellosis-free status, and that affects exports of livestock from the state. So this is more of a political issue than a biological issue for elk. This was a disease that was introduced to wild populations from livestock, and now is sort of just has a reservoir in these wild animals. Next slide. And here's a map of the endemic elk hunt areas in Wyoming that have brucellosis. So you'll see it's mostly concentrated from the GYE eastward, and it's similar in Idaho and Montana. It's sort of spread out from there. As there's also, you'll see kind of like from the GYE is where brucellosis is kind of spread. Next slide. There was a review that came out in 1998 looking at brucellosis across the greater Yellowstone ecosystem and the Northern Rockies. And there was a redo of that in 2020, this review of brucellosis. And basically they confirmed that no research that has been conducted since that review refutes the conclusion that feed grounds really exacerbate brucellosis in elk, and also cause sort of more of a threat to livestock as well. Next slide. One other disease that is pretty prevalent on elk feed grounds is hoof rot. This is a treponine associated hoof disease. It's caused by a bacteria. A lot of times elk get it when they're pawing through the crusty snow to try and get down to food underneath, and they scratch their paw or where the hoof meets the leg, or they scratch that, and then the bacteria finds entry into there. It causes their hoofs to become misshapen. You'll see in that picture up there at the corner. The two on the outside are normal hooves, and the middle is a hoof that is infected with this disease. It causes lameness, and pretty much the animal just gets to the point where they can't walk anymore because it's so painful, and that leads to starvation and dehydration. It's found almost exclusively on feed grounds in Wyoming. We just don't see this in wild deer and elk. And the other picture you see there below is the Camp Creek feed ground in 2014. Over 80 elk died that winter on the elk feed ground, and most of that was from hoof rot and other things. It's kind of a horrible way for an animal to die. It's very painful, and it's a long and prolonged death. And so this is something that like nobody wants to see an elk with hoof rot. And one of the things that really exacerbates it is having a concentrated amount of animals on feed grounds. Next slide. Some other items of concern about feed grounds. Scabies is another one. It's caused by a little mite that lives on the skin of animals, and that causes them to scratch a lot and scratch their fur off. And then they're more susceptible to predation and also just getting cold and hypothermia. Necrobacillosis is similar to what causes hoof rot, but it also can cause inflammation in the larynx and different types of infections. It can also cause a systemic infection for elk that can be found throughout its blood system, not only just, on outer extremities, but also can spread throughout the blood system and kill the animal that way. So the real problem with feed grounds is just having this density of animals. I mean, one thing the pandemic has really taught us recently is that when you have a concentration of any kind of mammal or animal that's all together in one place, and then one of them has a disease, it's just really easily spread when there's high densities. And so the feed grounds are really concentrating these animals into high densities. That's why really stopping feeding earlier or waiting longer to feed is not really a real solution, due to the fact that you're still having high concentrations when the animals are being fed. There's a technique where we can try and spread it out a little bit more, but we're talking on like very small tracts of land, probably 100 acres or less that most feed grounds are. And that's just causing, once again, just a sort of a breeding ground for disease. Another scary disease is bovine tuberculosis. That can infect people. It's not here yet, but it has been found in pretty much any kind of wild animal. Humans can get it. It would have huge implications for the livestock industry in Wyoming. They already have a couple deer. There was a couple deer farms up in Montana that had it. And that was, really scary for them. And it's something that if it did find its way into the feed grounds, that could also be another concern of something that could spread to livestock and make things a lot worse. Another thing about the feed grounds is contamination of water, soil, and vegetation in those areas. You have an enormous amount of density of animals in a small spot. That's a lot of feces and a lot of urine that's going into the soil. And so that is all runoff in the spring. And there's been some studies that have shown actually runoff from concentrated areas of elk still have like infectious prions in them, and that can be spread into the drinking water supply as well. And then carcass disposal too. So if we have a situation where chronic wasting disease gets really high prevalence rates in feed grounds, then that is going to set up a problem, because you can't just toss those, we don't want to leave those carcasses on the landscape, because then we're going to have problems with further infection of chronic wasting disease and further prion exacerbating. And so carcass disposal is another, just big concern for sure. Next slide. And there's also regional effects of Wyoming's feed grounds. Of course, Montana's concerned about chronic wasting disease coming their way. They're being squeezed from above by Alberta and British Columbia that also have high incidences of chronic wasting disease due to game farms. And back in 2017, the Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks Commission sent a letter to the Wyoming Game and Fish Department asking them that They began the process of closing feed grounds due to the facts of the effects that it will have on Montana and their chronic wasting disease problem. Next slide. And here's the most current chronic wasting disease map from the Center for Disease Control. You'll see Wyoming's kind of ground zero, and a lot of those other outlying things that you see are places where deer have been taken from game farms and transported to other states, for instance, like Michigan and Pennsylvania, even Mississippi and Arkansas is, that's a lot of how that has spread into those areas. But you'll also notice that all around Wyoming, other states are going to be affected by this and are being affected by it. And we're down to the point where we only have one county, Uinta County in Wyoming, that has not had a chronic wasting disease situation. So that's kind of a wrap up of diseases and the threats that feed grounds pose to our elk herds. I'll hand it off to Eric to talk a little bit more about solutions.
Well, thank you very much. And so we have right now reached the point of crisis when it comes to chronic wasting disease spreading into the Yellowstone ecosystem. And we have these feed grounds arcing across the southern tier of Yellowstone, where they're basically a super spreader event for chronic wasting disease waiting to happen. They've long been disease transmission hotspots for brucellosis, and they really haven't done anything to reduce the seropositive brucellosis issue with elk. So essentially now we've passed the point where we can think ahead and act proactively, and now we need to get a lot more decisive about our societal approach to these elk feed grounds. And so our proposed solutions circle around three main concepts: restoring the migration corridors that are left, and certainly some of them have been lost, but maintaining the ones that still remain; phasing out the feed grounds as rapidly as possible to minimize the chances of disease outbreaks; and then protecting and restoring native carnivores. And we'll talk about each of these three. Next slide, please. So this is a map showing the feed ground locations across northwestern Wyoming. And as you can see, they're fairly dense. And basically all of the areas where the elk used to winter have, except for perhaps the National Elk Refuge and parts of Grand Teton National Park, are now largely private ranch lands, and where cattle are wintered and where there are feed lines for hay. And this is why the feed grounds have been maintained in these areas, is basically to keep the elk away from the cattle. And this is seen to be a really compelling and important problem by Wyoming Game and Fish Department. But as we'll look at the next slide, go ahead and switch the slides. This is the area where, in red, where feed grounds are currently still occurring. And you can see that even in other parts of Wyoming that have elk populations, we don't feed the elk. Even in other parts of the Yellowstone ecosystem where brucellosis is an equally prevalent issue, we don't feed the elk. And so this is really more of a, kind of a political artifact of just doing things the way that the Wyoming Game and Fish has always done them, without a very good justification, without any science to back it. And so doing away with the elk feed grounds in this last little corner of native elk range in North America really doesn't pose any major biological issues. It does solve a lot of important biological problems, on the other hand. Next slide, please. And sometimes when you talk about closing elk feed grounds, you do get public sentiment that says, well, what's going to happen to the elk that don't get any feed? They're going to starve in the wintertime. The snows can be deep. And in 2005, the Greater Yellowstone Coalition did an analysis of how much forage was available on the winter ranges in the Gros Ventre Valley, which is one of the areas of focus for elk feed grounds. And they found that they could support 4,400 to 6,600 elk wintering on these feed grounds on 33 to 50% of the winter range, while consuming a little over half of the accessible forage without supplemental feeding. And that was assuming that the cattle were still there, taking off their half of the annual forage production off of the grazing allotments on federal public lands. So there actually is plenty of winter range out there for these elk, and supplemental feeding really is not justifiable on the basis that elk are going to starve to death. Next slide, please. And as noted, the state of Montana in 2017 saw the chronic wasting disease approaching the Yellowstone ecosystem, and the Wyoming state or the Montana State Senate had a resolution that Wyoming should disband its elk feed grounds immediately. And that passed unanimously in the Montana State Senate. And the Fish and Wildlife Commission in Montana also later that same year sent a letter to Wyoming Game and Fish asking them to close their feed grounds, because Montana was hoping to stop the spread of chronic wasting disease before it got into that state. And unfortunately, Wyoming didn't listen, and the chronic wasting disease continued to spread, and now it's in Montana as well. Next slide, please. Thinking about migration corridor reestablishment, this is a map that was created in 1898 by the League of American Sportsmen. There was a fellow by the name of Dr. Frank Dunham, who was a medical doctor in Lander, Wyoming, who first proposed a migration corridor and a winter range preserve in the Red Desert. And this was the original migration route for the Yellowstone elk. And in the 1890s, there were ranchers who documented 20,000 elk crossing the area around Pinedale on their way down the Wind River front into the Red Desert. And this is a migration corridor that now has been recently discovered by modern science to be in part the Red Desert to Hoback migration corridor for mule deer, and it also includes parts of the path of the pronghorn migration corridor. So protecting this migration corridor does offer some hope that maybe the elk migration could be restored. However, the idea of immediately restoring this larger migration corridor and the elk migration down to the Red Desert was tried in the 1940s. And what they did was they reintroduced elk down into the Red Desert and hoped that they would migrate back up into Jackson Hole for the summer and reestablish that migration corridor. But unfortunately, the elk tradition and instinct to migrate had apparently been lost. Those elk that were reintroduced to the Red Desert remained in the Red Desert year round and became the Steamboat Mountain elk herd. And so that effort to reestablish that migration corridor was never quite realized. But of course, if the Congress had listened to Dr. Frank Dunham in 1898, Yellowstone National Park would have been expanded to include what now is Grand Teton National Park, plus the migration corridor along the Wind River front, and a winter range reserve in the Red Desert. Now, today, there is the Wildlife Corridors Conservation Act, which is chiefly there to establish national migration corridors. And one of the migration corridors or two of the migration corridors that get a lot of talk about being established once this legislation eventually passes are the path of the pronghorn and the Red Desert to Hoback migration corridor for mule deer. Next slide, please. So the next item in terms of solutions would be allowing the restoration of native predators. And of course, the state of Wyoming has had a very aggressive policy to limit and even eliminate native predators, particularly outside the immediate environs of Yellowstone National Park. If you look at wolves, 85% of the state is managed by the state of Wyoming as a predatory animal area, which means that any wolf can be killed at any time, no bag limit, no seasons, not even a hunting license required. And it's a free fire zone that is essentially unregulated, and it's an extinction vortex for wolves. And so wolves find it impossible to get established outside that small trophy game area that surrounds Yellowstone National Park. And unfortunately, wolves are coursing predators. They're the ones that run elk and other prey species in open areas. That makes them the best possible fit for a predator to eliminate chronic wasting disease, because the slower animals, the diseased animals, would likely lose their nimbleness because of the brain degradation and lag behind and be easily picked off. Also, mountain lions are significant elk predators, and they might be useful, and grizzly bears can be important predators on occasion, although they concentrate more opportunistically on typically younger elk calves and less so on the adults that might be more prone to have chronic wasting disease. So they're probably the least of the three in terms of being effective ways of cutting chronic wasting disease out of the herd. Next slide, please. So this is a study that was done in 2010, investigating the relative effectiveness of mountain lions for selecting for chronic wasting disease infected prey versus human hunters. And the wildlife management community in the early days relied very heavily on the idea, well, we can increase the elk hunts and the number of take of elk, and that will help drive down chronic wasting disease. And that really didn't work. And the reason it didn't work was because human hunters don't select for diseased animals. And in fact, if you are a hunter and you want to have meat for your family, and you see an animal that is showing symptoms of chronic wasting disease, and it's logy and it's drooling and it looks emaciated, that's not the animal that you're going to select to kill. And that's probably a good thing, because if you killed and then ate that animal, there's a chance that you could become affected with chronic wasting disease as well. Now, mountain lions are ambush predators, and to the extent that they're taking elk, this study found that they were taking chronic wasting disease infected elk at a much higher rate than human hunters. And that makes a great deal of sense, because the slower, the weaker, the sicker animals are those that are easiest to take. And chronic wasting disease does not seem to infect these native carnivores the way it has been shown to cross over to primates. So that transmission to the actual mountain lion, to the actual wolf, has not been shown so far. Next slide, please. Just this year, there's a new study that was put out by Brandel and others, and it modeled the use of predators, particularly wolves and mountain lions, in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, and how they might possibly affect chronic wasting disease. So it was they were pointing exactly on the question that we're talking about here, with trying to find alternative remedies to getting rid of chronic wasting disease, or at least minimizing it. And what they found was that these predators, in typical circumstances, will focus their predation on the very young animals, the calves, and the very old animals, because they're easiest to catch. But when chronic wasting disease starts affecting a herd, and you have animals that are in the late stages of infection, they tend to be preferentially predated upon. So they ran a model based on their field data that they looked at in terms of which animals were getting killed and which age classes of elk were getting killed by predators. And they found that, lo and behold, mountain lions and elk would be effective in reducing the seroprevalence of chronic wasting disease across the herd. So one of the things the Wyoming Game and Fish Department, and in Montana and Idaho as well, could do is kind of take their boot off the neck of the native carnivore populations and allow them to repopulate up to their natural population, so that they could do their job and clean out the disease from the herd. That would not eliminate chronic wasting disease, because of course animals are infected for sometimes several years before they start losing their fitness and losing their ability to escape from predators. And they can shed prions and spread the disease, but not at as a great of rate as they do in the advanced stages of the disease. So both wolves and mountain lions are potential solutions to chronic wasting disease, but we have to stop trying to limit or eliminate their populations. Next slide, please. So what then can we do about brucellosis? And this is a real conundrum. And the reality is that the livestock industry in the greater Yellowstone area has basically taken all of the elk winter ranges and converted them to private ranch lands because those were the most fertile and productive areas for wintering cattle. And so for the same reasons that the elk will want to use these valley bottom areas for wintering, that the livestock industry has preempted them from using these native habitats and is now trying to keep the elk away from their original winter ranges. Now, bison have gotten the lion's share of the publicity in terms of spreading brucellosis to livestock, but there hasn't been one single event in which bison actually spread brucellosis to a beef herd. It's all been elk. And interestingly, the elk seroprevalence is typically around 5%, can be as much as 20%, as noted earlier in the presentation, in areas where there are feed grounds. And the National Academy of Sciences recently put out a report suggesting that, well, maybe we try again with the test and slaughter program. But the National Academy of Sciences clearly didn't understand that elk typically inhabit steep, heavily timbered habitat. And so capturing the vast majority of an elk herd to administer a test and slaughter program is practically infeasible. You can't do it. And so you could end up killing a lot of elk, which would certainly have a major negative impact on the tourism industry and the outfitting and guiding industry, but it wouldn't actually do much to reduce brucellosis. So if you really want to keep brucellosis out of the beef herd, really the only real solution to that is to take a look at the elk range in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, and to for the beef industry to decide that, lo and behold, we're not going to raise beef in this region anymore if it's really that important to us to maintain that brucellosis-free status. And if the beef industry does want to continue to graze in these same habitats that are also used by elk, which are going to be chronically infected with brucellosis, then they're going to have to accept the risk as a cost of doing business that they might have disease transmission of brucellosis from the elk back to the cattle where brucellosis originated from. Next slide, please. So back in about 2010, the head of the National Elk Refuge did an article on winter feeding of elk in Western North America. And the recommendations back in 2010 are pretty similar to what we would recommend today. Control the elk numbers to keep them within the carrying capacity of the habitat. Practice land use planning that integrates the need of elk populations and doesn't allow the continued degradation and fragmentation of elk habitats. Avoid the fragmentation of elk ranges that causes them to interrupt their migration routes between their summer and their winter ranges, and then use techniques that maintain or improve the productivity of elk winter ranges. And if we're worried about the amount of winter forage that's available to elk in the winter, the most easily manipulatable variable that's there is the amount of summer forage removal by livestock. So that's something that the Forest Service has the ability to manipulate and limit. And so if elk populations really did need extra forage, that extra forage is there for them if we don't put it into the bellies of cattle. So essentially, what we need to do from here, now that chronic wasting disease is starting to arrive on the doorsteps of these feed grounds, is to start to dismantle the feed ground systems, cease the feeding of elk, transition the elk back to native winter ranges and native food sources, and thereby allow them to disperse themselves across their native habitats instead of concentrating at high densities in a few areas where they're so at risk to the spread of this universally deadly and highly contagious chronic wasting disease. And I think at this point, we might be ready for question and answers.
Thank you, Eric, and thank you, Kristen. That was awesome. We have time for a few questions. If someone wants to jump in, feel free to raise your hand or put something in the chat if that's easier.
I have a question, and thanks, Ashley. So, Eric, I really liked how you mentioned how carnivores could act as really almost a vaccine, or they could act as a solution to these diseased, chronic wasted, infected animals. So, um, with that, with this game and fish management plan that Ashley mentioned, do you think it's possible for the game and fish to write in carnivore protection into this feed ground management plan, or do you think that's a different realm altogether?
Well, certainly the Wyoming Game and Fish Department ought to be looking at all possible solutions and all the problems that are out there. And they shouldn't be focusing narrowly only on the interests of the livestock industry, only on the interests of elk hunters, only on the interests of wildlife viewers. They should be looking first and foremost, in my view, at the interests of the elk themselves. Because what we're facing here with chronic wasting disease is the level of disease saturation in the herd is typically moving to levels that causes major declines in populations. And Yellowstone National Park and Grand Teton National Park and the surrounding national forests and wilderness areas have one of the largest and most popularly viewed elk populations in the United States. And we stand to lose that if we don't do something about the chronic wasting disease, both to slow its spread and to give the elk the most help that they can get in terms of cutting the disease out of the herd and not letting that seroprevalence get to those higher levels, those 20 to 30% infection rates that cause the herds to get decimated quite rapidly. And clearly, the restoration of native carnivores is a key part of that. That could include ceasing the trophy wolf hunting surrounding Yellowstone National Park. It could include changes to wolf management in what is now the predatory animal area that would allow those wolves to repopulate those areas of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem as well. It could include recommendations to USDA Wildlife Services not to engage in trapping or shooting or denning or aerial gunning of wolves and other native predators. Basically, we have artificially suppressed the density of these large predators that are supposed to be fulfilling their role in disease and contamination control. And it's not just for chronic wasting disease either, it's for brucellosis too, because these same large predators are also the scavengers that will be cleaning up the afterbirth of infected brucellosis infected elk and other animals, and then reducing the opportunity to spread brucellosis as well. So there are actually collateral benefits to the livestock industry from having more wolves on the landscape, particularly when you consider how few cows, calves, and sheep get taken every year in the 3 states surrounding Yellowstone.
Thanks, Eric. We probably have time for one more question. So George in the chat said, regarding brucellosis, I think I read a number of years ago that some of the cattle ranchers in Jackson Hole routinely vaccinate their herds. How much does a brucellosis vaccination program cost a cattle rancher?
Yeah, I think I can jump in here. The cost to cattle producers is, it's not nothing. It's definitely something that they would have to plan for and budget for. There are programs, within the Wyoming Game and Fish Department to help with some of that cost, if that is something that livestock producers do need help with. And there's other resources that livestock producers can use to also provide some help for them financially. I mean, if you think about things that you're vaccinating for anyway, this is just kind of one more to add to the repertoire. And really vaccinating cattle is way more effective than vaccinating wild animals. We pretty much just cannot effectively vaccinate enough wildlife in order to make it worth it. So yeah, it's, it's something to be considered, and it's just as like with fencing too. That is another solution that Casey sort of alluded to in the beginning, is that fencing certain, whether it's feed lines for livestock or hay stores, is also a cost that is there, but is something that there are programs available to help with that cost. And if we look at how much we're pumping into feeding wildlife every year, feeding the elk and bison on the elk refuge, we have those funds that could instead be switched over to, helping to implement some of these things, and then also yeah, come up with good solutions and innovative ways that we can sort of work around these problems.
Thank you, Kristen. That was awesome. I will hand it over to Casey, who has some actionable things that we can do about this.
Thanks so much, Ashley. And yeah, Kristen and Eric, you nailed it. So to close, we have an ask for all of you participants. We do not like to see wild animals be treated like livestock. Elk deserve to live wild and free in their natural habitat. In their natural habitat. So as Ashley mentioned, the Wyoming Game and Fish is currently writing an elk feed ground management plan. So that plan will direct the management of these feed grounds probably for the next 15 to 20 years. So we're at a really vital point right now. There has been a little bit of a public process, but not much. So we really wanted to get the word out that this elk management plan is happening. And we want to ask all of you here today to please help us out. Please help the elk, and email the Wyoming Game and Fish and tell them to phase out elk feed grounds. If you go to the next slide, Rob, thank you. So this is their email address. I talked with Mark Goki, who is an information specialist with the Game and Fish, and he is open to receiving feedback, and they're all open to receiving feedback for this elk management plan. The Sierra Club Wyoming is definitely giving them recommendations and in communication about this plan, and we're hoping to help them out, but they need to hear from the public too. So I personally will reach out to each of you that is on the call, and if you have any specific questions, or if you need help writing comments or an email, I'm super happy to help you do that. And yeah, I think that's it for today. We do have some resources that Rob posted in the chat. There's a lot of information out there, so don't hesitate to reach out if you need anything, and I'll pass it back to Ashley.
Yeah, thanks, Casey. I mean, that was everything. Big thanks to Kristen and Eric for sharing their expertise with us. I learned a ton. That was awesome. And feel free to reach out to Casey if you want to get involved with any of the Sierra Club volunteer groups. Thanks, everyone. Have a good rest of your night.
Thank you.